The studio lights never felt as bright as they did that morning. They sliced through the air like 1,000 patient eyes, eager, curious, hungry for something they knew belonged to the small, private world of two people who had, for years, made intimacy into a morning ritual for millions. Kelly walked onto the set with her usual practiced ease, smile polished, hair perfect, wardrobe utterly effortless. Yet there was a tremor in her stride that the teleprompter couldn't smooth away. The audience clapped because that is what audiences do. The band played because that is what bands do. The city outside moved along as it always did. Delivery trucks, joggers, pigeons pecking at morning scraps, while inside the studio a life's chapter was about to tilt. Mark had called 2 nights before. The call had been the kind of simple thing that, in other hands, would have been ordinary. We need to talk. He said it like a man who needed the words to do the heavy lifting for what his eyes and fingers couldn't. There were lines in his voice that Kelly had learned to read over 25 years of marriage, the thinness of hesitation, the slight rounding of consonants when he was bracing for impact. He had been offered an opportunity, one that, on paper, sounded like a dream come true, one that demanded months away, an immersion in a role overseas, a commitment that would outstretch their neatly scheduled weeks and the kind of togetherness that had become the backbone of their lives. They had never been an ordinary couple. Their romance began under studio lights, their courtship a public theater of giddy interviews and magazine spreads. They had built a family around improvisations and late-night talk show deadlines, laundry baskets and lullabies, stocked between sound checks and red carpets. Their marriage had always had an audience, but the private parts of their story, two people learning to grow around each other, the quiet compromises, the fights patched up with laughter and compromise, had been fiercely guarded. This decision, then, felt like the cruelest sort of public and private collision, a professional ascent that required personal sacrifice, a promise to pursue art that would demand the absence of a daily fixture in someone's life. She could have said no. They both knew that. The opportunity could have been declined out of devotion or bargaining or fear. But Mark had been adamant in the way only the certain can be. "This is something I have to do," he had told her in the middle of their kitchen, where the coffee maker hummed and a school backpack drooped over a chair. "I can't look back and wonder if I let it pass me by." Kelly had tried to keep anger from the conversation. Anger would have done nothing but widen the distance between the decision and her heart. Instead, the two of them spent the night listing small things they would miss. Mark's habit of humming when he did the dishes, the exact angle he took when he lifted their son's skateboard off a porch, the particular cadence of his good night that had become a punctuation mark at the end of any day. Now, on live television, Kelly was supposed to be rousing, bubbly, full of the brand of late-morning warmth that had been her armor for decades. The producers had prepared segues, clips, a pre-recorded montage of Mark's career highlights. But as the moment approached, a segment billed as a special farewell, the world narrowed to a man standing in the audience like any other viewer, leaning against a set wall with a nervousness that he did his best to hide. When she broke into the first lines of the monologue, it sounded rehearsed in an entirely new way. "Good morning," she said, and the syllables carried an intimacy that silenced the usual show buzz. She reached for the teleprompter, then didn't need it. "Today," she said, looking straight into the camera, "we're saying goodbye to a man who has been my husband, my partner in crime, my loudest cheerleader, and sometimes my most stubborn co-conspirator." There was a soft murmur in the audience that felt less like noise and more like a tide pulling at the edges of some fragile sandcastle. Kelly's voice tightened. She remembered how Mark had once on a whim agreed to play an extra in a tiny indie film that required him to sit on a bench and feed pigeons. He had laughed through the entire scene until the director called cut. He had ruined takes deliberately to annoy her, and she had loved him for it. He could be childish, tender, maddening, breathtakingly brave. She began to tell stories. In front of cameras and clicks, she unspooled memory after memory. how they had stumbled through a first date that neither of them remembered exactly but both insisted had been perfect, how during the early days of motherhood, Mark had learned to change diapers with a concentration that bordered on holy, how they had once gotten locked out of their own New York apartment in nothing but bathrobes and had chosen, in a kind of shared delirium, to order Chinese food from a corner stand while the night stretched its arms over the city. Her anecdotes were tiny, domestic proofs of a love story that had never been very cinematic in a traditional sense, more domestic sitcom than tragic romance, but perfectly theirs. "There's this thing Mark does," she said, voice wobbling, "when he's trying not to cry. He'll start telling jokes that are so terrible you can't do anything but laugh, and then the laughter just turns into real crying. It's like he builds his own emergency exit." Mark laughed under his breath. The audience followed, because people know how to follow. But Kelly's laughter had cracked. A single tear traced down her cheek, and she didn't try to wipe it away. Cameras are merciless, and the little glitch in her makeup seemed to make her more human to the millions watching at home than any carefully curated Instagram post ever could. The montage played. Clips of Mark in different roles flickered across the screen. A young heartthrob on soaps, a man discovering his range on stage and screen, a husband who'd been both a quiet anchor and a flashing storm. The montage ended on a home video, Mark and Kelly dancing in their living room, the children tangled in their feet, laundry piled like soft mountains on a couch. The music swelled. The studio was a soft, communal throat of breath. When it was his turn to speak, Mark walked up to the host's chair as if he had rehearsed the steps in his mind 1,000 times, but never, until just now, had actually taken them. He put his hand on Kelly's knee, a small, anchoring gesture that seemed to say everything and nothing all at once. "I promised we'd never make a decision out of fear," he said, looking to their kids who watched from the front row with faces that balanced between pride and puzzlement. "This is one of those terrifying good things." He spoke of the project, the director's vision, the role that stirred him like coffee, hot, urgent, necessary. He spoke of the logistics, too, of months in a different country, the training, the loss of predictable nights, and the gain of something he felt he had to try. The camera cut to Kelly's face a lot, because the story belonged to both of them. Mark was not leaving because he was alone in his desire. He was leaving because two people's life is a braided rope, sometimes pulled taut by each other's ambitions. At one point, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook. He opened it and read, voice steady, a list he'd written weeks earlier of what he'd miss. The inhale of their old cat when she surprised him, the way their youngest smoothed his hair before school, the sound of Kelly's laugh when it bounced off the kitchen tiles. He read the last one, the way she says my name at 2 a.m. when I'm awake and she thinks I'm sleeping, and faltered into a full laugh that turned to a sob. The cameras did not flinch. The world watched. After the segment, the band played a slow song, and the hosts moved to a break. Backstage, however, is where private life happens in public. Lights dimmed, but the heat remained. Reporters scribbled, producers whispered, and there, in a small dressing room, Kelly and Mark stood facing each other like two characters at the end of a play where the curtain was unsure whether it should fall. They had rehearsed this conversation, too, in fits and starts, words to say and words to avoid. There had been lists exchanged on napkins, bargaining that never quite tried to make the impossible doable. "Promise me you'll come back," Kelly said, trying her best to fashion a bargain from vulnerability. "Promise me you'll call every day." "I promise," Mark said, and there was nothing theatrical about the way he said it. It was a vow with the weight of breakfast cereal spoons and highway miles. Their oldest son, watching the scene with a new maturity, hugged his mother first, then his father. The embrace was a tangle of childhood and adulthood, the messy signage of families learning the geography of change. Kelly whispered, "We'll FaceTime. We'll send stupid videos. We'll make it as normal as we can." "Normal," Mark repeated. The words sounded fragile in his mouth, as if it were a souvenir to be handled with care. The flight, by the time the cameras start again, was scheduled for the end of the week. In the days between the announcement and the departure, the family staged 1,000 small goodbyes, breakfast with extra pancakes, a soccer game where Mark played terribly on purpose because he wanted to be the comically bad hero his children could laugh at later, a late-night porch conversation where the adults sat and smoked, him tobacco-free, her inhaling nothing but the cold air, the city wrapped around them like a coat. On the final night, they held what Kelly called an ordinary extraordinary dinner at their kitchen table. There were candles because candles make anything ceremonial, and a cake because the children demanded an excuse for frosting. Around the table, they rehearsed the order of things, hugs, promises, jokes to be told at airports. They laughed until some of them started to cry, the way people do when the line between grief and gratitude blurs. After the children had gone to bed, the house grew quiet. They sat on the couch, close enough that their knees touched, and watched home videos of themselves when they had been younger, clumsy wedding dances, a honeymoon montage suffused with bad hotel lighting, their early years of parenthood where they were both visibly exhausted but incandescent in that way new parents are. It was the kind of viewing where you see yourselves and feel complete. For a moment, everything made sense. Do you ever think about how weird it is that we met? Kelly asked, voice soft as the TV glow. She had asked it 100 times, and it never failed to rattle the soft box of memory. Every day, Mark said, and then he laughed. And that you still fit into those jeans is a crime against the laws of physics. She elbowed him, and it felt like the small domestic rituals they had perfected over decades, meant to keep distance from emotion's two raw edges, were more valuable than any speech. The airport's waiting area had a different quality to it than the studio. Airports are about liminalities, departures.